Welcome, everybody. This is episode 6 of the Bark Report. I am Mark Baruth, your host and CEO here at Coopable. And man, we are in for a treat today. We're going to talk to somebody that I think every dealership should know about, but maybe not every dealership does know about. And we're going to try to fix that today. So we're here with my good friend, Chris Austin, who is the Chief Revenue Officer at Strategic Source. And we're going to talk a lot about how dealerships can save money today. So Chris, welcome to the show, man. Thanks for being here.
Thanks so much, Mark, for having me on today. And it's good to see you on here. And I appreciate the audience tuning in and I look forward to this conversation today. So thanks for having me.
Me too. I know. I met Chris, gosh, I think it was in Raleigh, North Carolina about a year or so ago at a conference that we were both attending. And it's funny, we keep crossing paths and keep running into each other at various places. I got invited to speak at a 20 group for CPAs for automotive, and I was excited, and it was in Boston, later last year. I walk into the room, and who do I see but Chris sitting there already? I'm like, oh, hey, here we are again. So I've been really pleased to get to know Chris and Strategic Source over the last year or so, and we've actually built, I think, a really great partnership of referring business to each other back and forth over that time frame, and we've greatly valued and appreciated that. So for those who don't know what Strategic Source is, because before I met you guys last year, I wasn't aware of you, and I think everybody should be aware of you. So just tell us a little bit about who you guys are, where you got started, and what your mission and vision is.
Sure. Yeah. So Strategic Source, we've been around roughly 30 years, and we're based out of Minneapolis. We really work all over the country, even different parts of Canada. But really what we focus on are helping businesses save money, improve profitability. My father started the company over 30 years ago and had a background in Northwest Airlines, if you remember them before they acquired them. So he had a strong purchasing background, knew he wanted to create some, his own business, and really focus on expenses and renegotiating and procurement. So we started off locally here in Minneapolis, working with not just in the automotive space, but manufacturing companies, restaurants, gaming, manufacturing, and whatnot. But we actually got our start in automotive with this local Saturn franchise when that was still around.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Like you were mentioning, Mark, we kind of grew off of like different networking opportunities or 20 groups, as we see so often in the automotive space, dip meetings and whatnot. So we got our start with the Rydell group about 25 years ago, and then really grew based off referrals and word of mouth really all over the country. But yeah, what we do with not just dealerships, but any business is really go in and look at their expenses today in terms of where are they spending every dollar. And we have an assignment to that, to different categories, and classifying all their spend. We see so often that most businesses, especially in the automotive space, they know there's a problem with expenses, but they don't necessarily have a plan or know where to start, where to begin. So we really go and kind of do that assessment phase and understand, here are all our expenses today, classify them into the appropriate buckets, manage all their contracts, get all those contracts centralized, because we find so often they're decentralized in different managers, filing cabinets, or maybe some are tucked away in emails and whatnot. So
for sure.
Help with that. Also audits, auditing suppliers. We know that we actually started our audit department based on uniform companies. We had so many complaints coming from our clients that said, hey, I think we're being charged for techs that haven't been here in months and years, and I don't think we're paying the correct amount for the pants, the shirts, the jackets, and so on. So we started auditing bills based on their contracts, and then spread that out to other departments and other really every department in the automotive space. So we audit quite often, but that's how we got our start. Really, automotive, we see a huge gap in the space today. Automotive groups are typically small enough where they can't justify maybe a procurement or sourcing department full time, and that typically falls on department heads, and maybe at a fraction of their time. So that's really where we come in and work with those department heads and C-suite individuals and meet with them monthly and really start attacking expenses with a strategic approach. So it's been a neat industry to serve. And but yeah, that's kind of how we got our start here, locally in Minneapolis, and then really grew across the country.
Yeah, you guys are everywhere. Every time I log into LinkedIn, I actually reached out to some folks on your team. I was like, we need to find out where you guys are going because we want to be there too. I think every time I log in, you guys are at a state conference somewhere, whether it's South Carolina or Georgia or
Yep.
everywhere. Montana. I think we're going to be with you guys in Montana next month.
Yep.
So I'm excited for that. I've never been to Montana. I hear it's beautiful. It's one of the three states I've still got to get to. So I'm
Yeah.
excited for that one. So you mentioned, and we see this too, where you've got dealerships who have contracts in file cabinets somewhere or buried in somebody's email who left the dealership 6 years ago,
Yep.
things along those lines. What is your opinion, the biggest leak that dealerships have right now? If you when you go in and you conduct your audits, where do you see the greatest opportunity for dealerships to stop having money go out the back door right now?
Yeah, that's a great question. And this is something we follow pretty closely with our sourcing team and our client services team. We don't really see a leak in one area or department. We really see this all over the board.
Hmm.
And just a few examples of some of those leaks. I would say shop supplies comes to mind in terms
Okay.
of, our clients typically have a broad supplier base, meaning you've got maybe one supplier for your nuts and bolts, one for your wheel weights, one for your nitrile gloves and batteries and so on. The list goes on and on. There's a list of 450 items that we quote consistently in shop supplies. But there tends to be a lot of leak in terms of the supplier base being broad, meaning all of those supplies, those 450, commonly used items can really be supplied by one supplier if you strategically attack this category and understand everything you've ordered within the last year, and then start comparing, some of your pricing to what the benchmarks are or competitive pricing in the market. So shop supplies has been a big one to not only reduce costs but reduce supplier base and help the back office staff and also the management team manage less suppliers. So that's a big one. Credit card processing fees. This is one I would say has kind of taken off the last 5 years in particular, where we're starting to see our clients actually proactively start negotiating their rates. There are so many competitors out there in the credit card processing space, especially surcharging to customers. I still consider that fairly new within the last 5 to 6 years, where we start seeing our clients switching over to surcharging, charging their customers for the processing fees. That's a big one, but we are seeing our savings start to dwindle a little because our clients are becoming proactive in addressing the credit card fees. Credit bureau is another big one where,
Mm.
a couple comes in, to a dealership and they, instead of pulling one credit report, in some cases, we're seeing them pulling, the sales team just by process pulling 6 reports, whereas you could get away with one if you
Wow.
get that desired credit score. Just pulling one report versus 6 for a couple that comes in. So that's one. There's a big opportunity, not just on the cost, but again, process change with the sales team. Some other ones we see that are common: shipping costs, your FedEx and UPS, depending on how you're classifying, if ground, next day air. So we see a big opportunity there. FedEx and UPS just renegotiating, or in some cases using resellers. But that's a big one. Even simple things like office supplies. Again, one that's not necessarily a supplier necessarily tied to whether it's a national, regional, or local supplier, but that's an easy one where, similar to the shop supplies, you look at everything you've ordered in the last year, paper and cartridges being a big expense. But that's an easy one to start attacking as well. We've seen savings anywhere from 20 to 28%, I would say, the last quarter in office supplies alone. So, really every department, there's an opportunity is what we're seeing. Fixed ops, finance, office related expenses, even C-suite, marketing and advertising that's typically handled by some general managers or some of the
Mhm.
key execs. But yeah, there's big opportunities, but what we do at the end of the year, Mark, with our sourcing results is understand how much we've saved our clients across the board and the average savings. So when we kind of prepare for the next year or putting, strategic plans in place, we want to see what we've seen for results, aggressive results where our clients are spending the most, and start prioritizing those at the top. Also based on expiration dates too. We want to make sure those expiration dates of the contracts they have with suppliers are factored in as well. So there's a lot that goes into, strategically planning, for expenses, as there's only so much time. But there's great ways to prioritize those expenses from top to bottom, and also getting the client's feedback too. What are some of your pain points? What are some areas where you guys haven't had any benchmarks, or maybe haven't had a chance or the expertise to attack these expenses appropriately?
You guys are dealing with so many things. It's crazy. I love when I log in on LinkedIn and I see your team and the dealership standing there with one of the awards that they've won, right? For saving $250,000 or $500,000 and $1 million. And I'm sure it just keeps going up and up and up after that. It's so tangible, and that's one of the things. I'm never too proud to beg, Chris. I'm like Emily, we need to do that. We need to start putting up things saying like we saved you money on co-op or something like that, because it's so tangible and it's so visual to be like, oh my gosh, yeah, here's your award, like for going through this. And I can't imagine that there's any other vendor in the space that makes as big a financial impact on the dealership's bottom line as Strategic Source does, because every department you just mentioned are things that are touching so many aspects of the dealership, whether it is the fixed ops or the variable ops or the F&I or all these things that you're talking about. When you look at that across all those departments, I think dealerships, and I would be curious to get your thoughts on this. I don't think they leverage their buying power as a group nearly as well as they should.
Right.
You mentioned all these general managers at various dealerships signing up for things. We see this when we come in and do a co-op audit for dealerships. Quite often, we'll see that they've got multiple vendors executing the same thing.
Yes.
Yeah, so you'd be like, "Hey, did you realize you have three chat tools on your website? I don't know if you're using all three, but you're paying for all three. I can tell you that."
Yep.
Or you've got a budget of $56,000 a month for co-op. Did you know you're submitting $125,000 against that every single month? And that other $70,000 is just coming out of your pocket. Did you know that? So what are you seeing in dealerships as far as those kind of rogue behaviors where you've got a GM at the Buick store signing up for one thing, a GM at the Toyota store signing up for another thing, a GM at the Nissan store signing up for other things? How do you kind of get everybody on the same page? Because to me, that's one of the biggest challenges from a dealership is these general managers who kind of act as owner operators of their own business, and they don't necessarily want to do the same thing that the Toyota store is doing. So how do you get people on the same page with that?
Yeah, that's a great question. It can kind of leads to our assessment process when we begin with a dealership, whether you're a single point or you have 60, 70 plus locations spread across the country. But really it comes down to their DMS system. Really, step one, to understand how many suppliers you have. We typically go back a year. If we were to start tomorrow with an expense plan, we go back about a year, and that includes every on-demand check, accounts payable, ACH, and also credit cards. We're seeing a lot of dealers using credit cards to pay suppliers. But the reason that's important, that gives us the history of every dollar you've spent within the dealership. And that really tells us the truth, Mark, to your point of how many general managers are involved, how many stores are involved here, and how decentralized is the supplier base today. So that's going to tell us, number one, if they have a centralized approach or decentralized approach. We know that dealerships today are, you mentioned the amount of expense categories. We're up to 160 plus that we see in the dealership space today, which is
Crazy.
so we're not deep in every category. We have benchmarks in most of them. But to give you an example, like shop supplies, we may attack that 150 times a year for our clients, so we know it pretty well. Same thing with credit cards and uniforms and laundry and body shop supplies and so on. But overall, what we do with that DMS information is we classify all those expenses into the appropriate buckets and then communicate that back to the client that, hey, you've got 40 different suppliers here that we could start dwindling down to get a primary in place and a backup if that primary isn't performing up to your standards. So that really is a great roadmap to understand here's what the truth is today and then where we can go forward to fix that. Yeah, when we started off as a business, we were looking at those DMS systems and looking at GL codes, and dealerships classify their expenses very broadly. You see
Mm.
supplies, you see maintenance, you see other miscellaneous, and so on. We're breaking those down in the appropriate buckets, so you have a clear description of where are we too broad with our supplier base, how much are we spending, so we know how to prioritize them. But really, going back to your question of how we get GMs on board, because what we find is that most general managers, especially when you're dealing with multiple general managers, really care about their store, right? And their,
Yes.
maybe the community they're in. So in some cases, we do need to have multiple supplier options, depend on where they're located regionally. Not every if you prefer local suppliers, that's fine. We know there's a lot of relationships where those suppliers, like you mentioned with the state associations, a lot of those suppliers are sponsors for some of these state events that we're at. And the relationships, in some cases, they're customers as well. So we want to understand before we start a project, what's important to them. Do you want to stay local in the community? Are you looking for more of a regional supplier? Maybe it's a national supplier, something like office supplies. um, you know, so what we find is every dealer is a little different, but how we really get buy-in is really talking to those department heads, whether you're a general manager, you're a fixed ops director, manager, you're a CFO or controller, is really get their input and their buy-in in terms of what does a perfect solution look like for you? What does a perfect supplier look like for you? So we can listen to that criteria, take it to our sourcing team, and our sourcing reaches out to suppliers that meet those needs. We don't want to bring back a cookie cutter recommendation of a national supplier that's not going to meet our clients' needs. It's because that's not going to help them out in the long run. So we try to do that homework on the front end, listen to the team, listen to those general managers, what's important to you in terms of a solution, and then reach out to at least anywhere from 3 to 5, maybe more suppliers, depending on how big the group is. So when we come back with an analysis, they can look at options A, B, C, and D, and so on. And they still choose. They're still in the driver's seat in terms of the supplier they're working with. But now you're equipped with benchmarks and you're understanding here's how much we're paying today. Here's what a competitor is offering for an apples to apples comparison. And they still choose. They still choose who they work with. We don't have egg on our face if we're trying to drive them to a different supplier. But they still choose. And how we work with suppliers, yes, we have relationships with suppliers, but we're not taking as much of a cup of coffee from, when we're at NADA or any of these shows. We're working on behalf of our clients. So they're really the ones that are driving the decisions. We're helping them to get to that decision. But overall, they make the decision. We help them implement and then audit as a follow-up. So, but that helps a decentralized group. And we've seen plenty of examples with 30 store groups where you have so many stakeholders and decision makers. But if we're not listening to what their priorities are and what's important to them, then shame on us on the back end. But we gotta do our homework with those stakeholders to make sure we're driving them and they're seeing results in a timely fashion.
One thing you mentioned there, Chris, I think is super important because we operate under the same principle, which is we don't take anything from anybody. And I was actually pleasantly surprised when strategic stores started referring co-opable to some dealerships. I was like, I met you and Chris Mandry and so I knew what kind of character you guys were, but it was really nice just to hear like we're not asking for a kickback, we're not asking for anything. We would just like it if you could give our dealerships the best possible pricing. Like that's all you're looking for, right? Is the best possible pricing for your dealers. And I
Yep.
think it gives you that wonderful place of integrity that you can operate from, which means you get to make the best recommendations, not the one that line the pockets of strategic source. And I think that's, you mentioned that briefly, but I did want to call that out, that I know that to be true because we do have a vendor partnership with you, and I know that you don't ask for kickbacks, or you don't accept cups of coffee, from anybody. I know you're very ethical and very moral, if that's the right word, when it comes to that aspect of the business. So something that you guys should definitely be proud of. And not very common in the automotive business. There's so much back scratching in this business.
Yeah.
So that's really cool. So when you mentioned you're looking at 160 plus cost categories, it reminded me of this story from my youth. My mom had a friend who was out of work, and she was trying to clean people's houses just to kind of make ends meet. And so she was always scheduled to clean our house on Saturdays. And on Fridays, my mom would make my older brother and me clean the entire house, because she's like, well, I don't want to be embarrassed when my friend comes over to clean our house that we've got a messy house. So we have to clean first. And then when she comes over, they would just sit around and drink coffee and talk. And my mom would pay her $100 and she'd go home. I imagine we see this with Co-opable. I imagine you guys see it times 50, where you've got dealerships who are probably a little, I don't know if embarrassed is the right word, but definitely hesitant to peel back the curtain, right? Or and be like, we've got a little bit of a dumpster fire going on here. So what's your message to dealers who might be a little anxious or a little hesitant to let somebody actually see what's going on inside their business from a financial perspective?
Yeah, that's a great outlook on, I guess our approach when we begin with a new client, or even when we're talking to them in the prospect phase, is that they're skeptical, or they believe there could be an issue with expenses. And we typically see, at least in the dealership space, instead of fixing the problem, let's put more towards marketing and advertising to increase sales as a kind of a mini Band-Aid, right?
Yeah.
To fix the expense problem, which it's not. Dealerships are so driven by sales and service and parts, rightfully so, but at the same time they really don't have that background in negotiating, renegotiating their expenses, or even where to start. So what we typically find is that some of the groups that think they're the leanest with expenses tend to have the biggest problem. Some of the groups that think they have the biggest problem out there tend to be the leanest. So it's kind of a contradictory statement, but that's what we find after doing this for 30 years. And really, in some cases, it just takes a few benchmarks, or maybe they send in a statement or some invoices for the past 3 months, and then we compare that to some of our benchmarks to show them, hey, here's where you're doing well. Here's where there's some opportunity, where we really see our benchmarks. There's a lot of opportunity for savings here just by renegotiating with your supplier. Or 50% of the time, that's what we do is renegotiate with their supplier based on our stats, even backing up to 2025. Or if they want to make a change, if the service levels aren't there, if the quality of products aren't there, and a change is necessary, there's plenty of competition depending on the expense category. But in some cases, it just takes a prove it approach to say, hey, we're skeptical, but we need to see some proof in the pudding here. And really, it comes down to what they're paying, the invoices. That's what, to me, we talked about the DMS system. That gives a good snapshot of everything you've spent in the last year. Well, the invoices are really what you're paying for down to the item level for that service or supply. So we are constantly, something that's super important to a strategic source is current invoicing from our clients, so we understand what's competitive, what's not, and what's middle of the road. But overall, that tends to get buy-in. If we get a home run or two within the first 60 days, I think that trust comes over time. And then that opens up other areas of expense in other departments, across those 160 plus areas that we're currently managing today for our clients. So yeah, it just takes a few home runs. And in some cases, we find our clients' pricing is pretty stellar. They've had someone on the team or spent some time either collecting benchmarks from different 20 groups or different names of suppliers that have worked out well for them. And we report that to them. Hey, we got great pricing here. Let's keep this in place. Let's lock it in for another year or two, so those prices stay constant and we don't see the price creep. jumping, month over month, and then move on to the next expense category. But overall, I think that's what gets by, and it's a few home runs and just honesty, like you mentioned before, of hey, you guys aren't completely screwed up like you anticipated. But showing them where they're doing well, where there's areas of opportunity, but it really starts with the plan. And I think so many dealerships, they're short on time, just like every business we see. Everyone's short on time. Suppliers are short on time. It's just a matter of prioritizing, making this a priority, even though there's not typically a procurement department unless you're one of the bigger automotive groups in the country. So, yeah.
That makes a lot of sense. As you mentioned, the dealerships who think that they're in the best position sometimes are in the worst, and vice versa. We see that too, where there's a lot of dealerships who, they say you can look at our co-op, but you're probably not going to find anything. We do a really good job. I'm like, hey,
Yep.
you know what? At the very least, then you'll have a third-party agnostic person who's looking at it and says, "You're right. You are doing a very good job, and you may not need our help, or maybe you, like you said, lock that pricing in for another 24 month of service agreement or whatever it happens to be." I think it's good just to have that peace of mind. So I can't imagine why any dealership wouldn't call Strategic Source. To me, it feels like the biggest no-brainer on the planet.
Yep.
But I also imagine that you probably make some vendors mad sometimes. I would imagine, right? What's like, I've always heard that dealerships, and when we talk to GMs, they'll kind of verify this for us that like, if an expense is under like $1,000, it kind of tends to fly under the radar at a dealership, especially if it's a bigger group or something like that. Like if it's 500, 600, $700, who even cares? Just send the check. We see that a lot. And I wonder, what is the biggest kind of like micro expense that you guys find that you're able to get rid of for dealerships on at scale, right? So unnecessary expenses or vendors charging unnecessary fees. Where are some of the, I mean, it's probably easy to find, I shouldn't say easy, but it's probably easier to find like, oh my gosh, here's a $30,000 bill that you can shrink to 20. But what about that like $600 bill that you could shrink to 300? Things like that. Like where are you finding these micro, kind of savings for dealers?
Well, that's a good point. What we find is that those pennies add up to millions depending on the group size. And
Mm-hmm.
the per item cost may be low, but depending on how often you're ordering those items, those can add up to hundreds of thousands, if not millions, for some of the larger groups across the country. Kind of going back to that office supply example, as we look at, we tend to see a lot of office managers maybe looking at Amazon for, a deal of the week, deal of the month in terms of maybe paper or cartridges or staplers and whatnot, which can seem like pennies when you're looking at pens and some of those office supplies. But what we find is those costs, those specials aren't locked in long term. Our focus is really to lock those prices in for at least 12 to 24 months, because we hear so often from dealerships today that price creep. We feel that there's price creep going on. We have inconsistent prices from one dealership to the next. Even in the same billing cycle, we see vendors charging different prices for the same items in the same billing cycle. So, whether it's pens or staplers or manila folders, same thing on the shop supply side, where you have so many different items you can order. We tend to focus on a core item list of here's what most dealerships have been ordering for the past 25 years. That's why the history is so important. But we try to drive them to here's what you're ordering the most often, and then deeply discount those items. And then we have a different discount for all the other items you may be ordering once or twice a year. But overall, we want to make sure those prices are consistent and locked in so there are no surprises. So when we go back and audit 60 days after we implement any of these programs, the client, the peace of mind is really ensuring that, yes, here's the price we've agreed to, and we're actually being charged that price going forward. And if not, we have to go after those credits with suppliers. But I would say the detail, locking in your commonly ordered items is a big deal. And also the business terms too. We want to make sure shipping costs, tax, everything is factored in. So the analysis we bring back to a client, yes, it's important, all the items they're ordering, but all those ancillary charges you're seeing on the bills are just as important as well. So that's something we tend to negotiate out. We want to make sure the suppliers are in a good are in a good standing or are profitable as well. But at the same time, a lot of our clients use us as the middleman because they have those special relationships in the community. They've been with some of these suppliers for decades, is what we found, especially those local suppliers. So they really use us to vet and make sure they're paying a fair price, and then that price is consistent over time. So that's a lot of our focus, is really digging into the detail. And our sourcing team, I think, really does a great job. Again, we're not lawyers by any means, but we read the agreements. We see so many of these agreements coming through, whether it's uniforms or the insurance side, the P&C, and we can make recommendations to our client just based on, hey, here's what we've done with other clients in terms of this category, taking out those auto renewals that you see so often on these contracts. But that we really rely on our sourcing team and our client services team that are managing these clients. They see these issues over and over again and are able to guide our clients kind of the best path moving forward. So is that helpful?
Oh, very, very helpful. We've been on a lot of these calls with their client services team as a recommended vendor. And I gotta say, y'all are top notch. Like, your team does a tremendous job, and you can see the trust that has been earned over time. We may say something, and to the dealer, you can see the dealer kind of looks at your client service rep as like, is that true? Or is that right? And and they're like, yeah, that's right. And they're like, okay, you can see that there's immense trust built up over time with your organization, and that can only come from providing great results. So in all of those categories. So I'm sure that you have horror stories, right?
Yeah.
I'm sure you've seen if you had to go back over your time, with strategic source, 20 plus years, 30 plus years, what do you think, without naming names, what's the biggest horror story you've come across in the last few years?
In terms of expenses, or just working with clients or suppliers, or
I would say just like dealers who are way overpaying for things, or maybe
oh,
being taken advantage by their partners.
we tend to see, so we work with single points that are around 65 million in revenue, all the way up to some of the mega groups. So we've had a single store where we uncovered about 4 million in savings and counting
Oof.
within 18 months,
Wow.
and which is almost unheard of for single points.
Yeah.
Obviously, the more stores you add on, the more spend we have to play with and improve. But we've seen, yeah, and that 4 million, really didn't just come from a few, home run categories. It really came from, probably 8 to 10, I would say, over the course of, well, for sure the first year, but over the course of 18 months, yeah, 4 million in savings. And I would say as we get into larger groups, 30 plus, upwards of 60, 70, we've been able to uncover anywhere from 8 to 10 million at about the 2 year mark, which I would say is a lot more common with large groups because their profitability seems to be stronger. Sales seem to be stronger depending on the brands they have. But at the same time, their spend tends to get out of control pretty quickly, especially when you start
Mhm.
looking at supplier base that's very decentralized. Again, general managers typically are the ones that are controlling the supplier base, depending on the group structure. We locally, I want to say this was about 10 years ago, we were looking at auto parts for a big 33 store group, and they had 215 different suppliers just for auto parts, non-OE. All right. So what we did is I organized a meeting with all the parts managers, 30 plus parts managers, and we looked at this list, communicated to them all the suppliers that showed up in their DMS system. And we really drilled that down to the top 8. Let's get this supplier base down to the top 8 suppliers. And we brought the suppliers in. They gave a 20-minute pitch on their non-OE auto parts program, some of the discounts, some of the service, that they could be there in a half hour or less with certain parts, as that was super important to the client. But what that did is that really alleviated a lot of stress on the financial team, cutting multiple checks for really the same suppliers each month. The savings, of course, were there. I think that was around 10 to 11 million in savings annually that we identified just in non-OE auto parts. But that's a very common theme, especially as you get into, 20, 30 plus stores where it's a very decentralized approach. So there's a lot of home runs that are just sitting there. But I would say the change is the biggest piece. Like you mentioned, I mean, in the dealership space, we tend to see some, archaic technology. NADA was kind of a big eye-opening, event to me the last few years, where we're starting to see AI, becoming more and more common, across multiple suppliers, multiple departments. But change, I would say, in the automotive space, dealerships are slower to adapt.
Yeah.
And and it's really just getting their focus and realizing that, hey, here's what the benefit is if we start changing our thinking, changing our approach, and start making expenses and contract management and auditing suppliers a priority. But really, it just starts with, I would say, forward-thinking leaders and management teams that are all on board. They see what the end goal is, and they see that, hey, the band-aid of spending more on marketing and advertising isn't working as a long-term goal, especially with sales that have been really inconsistent the last 2 to 3 years, depending on the brands. But yeah, some of those, we've seen huge wins in the uniform space. Again, looking at auditing suppliers and going back and realizing how many techs are being charged on uniform bills that haven't been there in months or years. And I think, some of these uniform companies realize that dealerships really don't have the time to dig into those bills to audit. They may be looking at a month-to-month audit. Hey, we spent 10,000 last month. Why did that jump up to 15,000 this month? Did we really hire that many techs to offset the cost or increase the cost? But that's a big piece there, is auditing the bills and the agreements they have in place, and verifying, hey, are we actually being charged what we've agreed to or not? So there's some huge
Yeah.
gaps that are in the auditing space.
Oh, I can't imagine. Like, we see this a lot too with turnkey providers, specifically in the automotive category, where they sign up for something, they think it's $5,000, and it's being sent directly to the OEM. It's hitting their part statement, so they never cut a check, right? It's just being automatically paid out by the part statement. And they're like, oh, how much do you think you're paying for this vendor versus what you are actually paying for this vendor? And
Yep.
and it happens kind of this, like you mentioned, this creep over time, where they sign up for something that's $5,000, and then 3 months later, the rep from the vendor comes in and says, "Hey, wouldn't you like to add this feature? It's only another $500." Okay,
Yep.
sure. And then another 3 months later, "Hey, you've got the opportunity to spotlight your inventory. Would you like to do that for another $1,000 a month?" And all of a sudden, a year later, your $5,000 bill is a $12,000 bill,
Right.
and they don't even know, because it's out of sight, out of mind. I would imagine that you see that a lot with things where, hey, we thought we were spending this, but we're actually spending, this.
Yep.
What's kind of some of the, I imagine, you mentioned you're an intermediary sometimes between the dealer and the vendors. I imagine those conversations are not always pleasant, when you're talking to the vendor. How do you handle that when you've got a vendor who, in your opinion, may be taking advantage of your client, or maybe not billing what they promised they were going to bill? Like you said, you're not lawyers, but I'm sure you have these kind of tough conversations at times.
Yeah, that's an issue that's come up quite a bit. When we come in and do an initial assessment and come back with results, it's tricky, because we're trying to get buy-in from the management team. And we're showing some pretty significant results in terms of what they're spending today, or maybe it's their purchasing policies. Maybe there's managers that are signing contracts, long term to give you an example. We had we so we have a contract tracker that kind of encompasses all the contracts that our clients are engaged in, and realized that a service director who did not have signing authority signed an 8-year uniform agreement that auto renewed, and when we looked at the pricing, it was about 80% off from our benchmarks. And they really thought that they had a great deal in place based on their longstanding relationship. So that was an uncomfortable conversation to bring to a dealer, owner, operator, principal, to realize that this supplier they had a great relationship with. In fact, this new contract they put in place for 8 years, which is unheard of. I've rarely come across a contract that long. We typically keep them around 2 to 4 years max.
Mm.
But that's an uncomfortable conversation. So we're trying to get, the department heads that we're working with on our side, right? We want to make sure we're an asset to them and we're an extension of their management team. But at the same time, we realize what we do is not 100% of their job. It's a small fraction of what they do, renegotiating with suppliers and managing those contracts and auditing suppliers for price compliance. So we've learned over time that we really want to become part of their team and as a partner, a long-term partner. We've had a number of clients that we've been working with for 15 plus years, whereas some clients really view this as a short-term, hey, let's get the low-hanging fruit and then we'll be fine for a few years. So we want to make sure that we're not showing up these managers, but at the same time, our job is to really come in as that third party and tell them what the truth is, and not necessarily worry about feelings, but we're trying to show them, hey, here's what the reality is. Now, what do we do moving forward? You got to, like we were talking about the renegotiating phase. If we want to stick with the supplier, great. We know what competitive pricing is. We can stick with them and renegotiate. If a change is necessary, there's plenty of competing suppliers out there, but really, I think it's coming to our clients with honesty and letting them know where they stand and what the opportunity is. We've become, some of these dealerships during our assessment phase, we've had dealers call up suppliers on the spot when we show them price comparisons and how screwed up their pricing is. So we're just sitting there in the background like, what? This is really going on during a meeting. But they do get
I
fired.
bet.
But as an owner operator, you have to. This is your checkbook. This is thousands, hundreds of thousands, if not millions, that are flying out the window every month or every year, depending on the group size. So they are passionate about that. They want to make sure they're running a profitable business, and a lot of that goes back to the supplier relationships. They assume because they've been working with these suppliers, and maybe due to their size, they assume that they're getting the best pricing. But unless you dig in, unless you have those benchmarks and price comparisons to compare to, you really don't know. So yeah, there's been a number of uncomfortable conversations, but at the same time, we try to show them that, hey, you're not doing anything wrong, but also you don't have all the tools and comparisons to make educated decisions. Again, because this isn't their full-time job. This is a fraction of what they're doing on a daily basis. So we found there's better ways to communicate those results over time and to still keep those relationships in place, whether it's the relationships with our clients and their suppliers and us too, making sure we're not showing up the management team as we're really striving to be that long-term partner with them.
That's gotta be difficult. Boy, I can't imagine it's comfortable. Now you'll have to name names, but I'm just curious. Are there vendors when you go into a dealership and you see the vendor on the sheet that you're like, oh boy, like these, they're probably taking the dealership for a ride. Do you kind of have a list of those?
We do, and we've got a list. And so not only do we wrap up our sourcing results every year in terms of what we saved our clients, but more importantly, it's audit results. And so we know that there's suppliers out there that are competitively priced. They may beat other suppliers in terms of, whether they're a service or supply. But to us, we don't always recommend the cheapest supplier. We realize that any supplier can come in and save you 30% on any expense category. And I bring up the example of cleaning, janitorial services. see that quite a bit where, hey, man, we got an opportunity here to save 30% on our cleaning. But if they're not cleaning the building to the standard that the dealership is used to, the savings are almost meaningless at that
Of
point.
course. Absolutely.
So we try to factor in, so it's not always looking at the cheapest supplier. It's really looking at that their audit results. We've got, going back to that audit report we wrap up, we know there are certain suppliers out there that don't follow the contracts that they have in place and don't honor the pricing. So we know that because we have to go after the credits after the audit results. So yeah, we've got it. There's quite an extensive list of suppliers that may have a decent reputation in terms of their pricing, but if they're not honoring that pricing, ongoing, or their service levels aren't there, we don't want to recommend those suppliers, strongly recommend those suppliers to our clients, because then we have egg on our face. Just, if we say, hey, they're one of the top two suppliers in this expense category, we got to factor in everything: their audit results, their service levels, their quality of products, because it's all important. It's not always about that, the savings and the bottom line. There's a lot of time added if you got a problem supplier that's not meeting your standards. So yeah, yeah. Without naming names, we do have that list of suppliers we try to guide our suppliers or our clients away from. But overall, they choose. They're choosing who they want to work with. We're doing that research for them and kind of giving our input.
No, that's a really good point. We had a situation recently where one of our clients called us and said, "Hey, we just hired a company to come in and evaluate all of our vendors." I was like, "Okay, sure." They're like, "Yeah, meet with them, but they can say whatever they want. They have full power to hire fire vendors, right?" I'm like, "Okay." We met with this company. I think it was a 7-minute call. They didn't ask too many questions, and the minute we got the call, I'm like, "Yeah, we're fired." Like I knew it like right away because I was like, they didn't really care what we did. They didn't really ask too many questions. They didn't really grasp what we did. And so, we get off the phone, and sure enough, about 24 hours later, here comes the cancellation notice, and then we get a general manager calling us saying, "You guys will be back. I guarantee." He's like, our owner brought in this company, and as a general manager, we don't really agree with it, and stay in touch. Like it won't be long and stuff like that. And I do think it's really important what you mentioned there, right? Like you can make the recommendations, you can make the suggestions, but because you don't have an ulterior motive, you're not trying to. Ultimately, this company was trying to replace us with themselves, right? They're like, oh, we can offer that same service, right?
Yeah.
And so, you don't have an ulterior motive. I always think it's funny when we talk to a dealership group or we talk to somebody and they're like, "Oh yeah, we have our agency. They handle co-op for us. We don't really need you guys." I'm like, "Great, sounds good," and they probably do a really good job. Let me ask you a question. Why would your agency want to handle your co-op? Why would they do that? And they're like, "Oh, and they don't even charge us for it." I'm like, do you think they might have an ulterior motive? Do you think it's possible that your agency would like to see your co-op budgets and would like to know what money you have and then would like to spend that on your behalf? Do you think that's possible? And you can see a light kind of flicker on sometimes. And to that point, like you mentioned, some of the longest standing relationships they have with these vendors are sometimes some of the worst ones.
Yeah.
And you see this kind of blind faith that dealers sometimes have in vendors, and you're like, I don't know why you have this blind faith. They're dragging you over the coals here, man. And in some cases they're not, of course. In some cases these vendors are great, but you know, unfortunately we do operate in a business that doesn't have the best reputation for honesty, and that is holistic. That's around all phases of the business, whether it's vendors or whether it's some unethical dealers that exist.
Sure.
It's really nice that anytime anytime I've had the opportunity to recommend strategic source to a dealer client of ours, I'm always like, I know that they're going to operate with 100%, ethical behavior, which is very rare to be able to say about somebody. So
Right.
I've kept you here for about 50 minutes, so I want to wrap up because I know you got other things to do. Um, you mentioned emerging trends that you saw in ADA with AI, and gosh, we've had, this is our sixth episode of this podcast, and they've all been great. But AI has crept into to each one of these conversations at some point, one or another. And I imagine there are dealers out there who think, oh, we could plug all of our expenses into AI, and it would probably say, show us where we can do savings, all that stuff. Why would we need somebody like Strategic Source? We get told that all the time. Oh, I have my AI do my co-op. I'm like, I hope you're ready for jail because you're
Yeah.
gonna commit some fraud at some point here. Like your AI makes
Yep.
mistakes. So as you see AI entering this space, how do you think that could positively or negatively impact, dealers being able to assess their spends and their budgets going forward?
Yeah, so that's something we're doing. We're heavily involved with at least AI in our world. Again, looking at benchmarks and contracts and auditing and renegotiating. So I don't know. I have not come across any dealership today that has been utilizing AI for their expenses, regardless if they're a one store or if they have 100 stores. Um, I do think that's coming at some point, but at the same time, it goes back to intellectual property that each of the businesses have and what they're doing with the AI. I
Mhm.
really think there's only so much public information out there in terms of invoicing and spend, some of that protected data that exists out there. We're using that really to help us classify, suppliers, look at our history of what we've been able to save our clients down to the item level. So I haven't seen that yet in the dealership space, but it's coming. To me, this is still fairly new. I think we're all still learning AI together. Even
Mhm.
in our company, we've got people that are much more experienced and others that are kind of intermediate and just learning how AI and what some of the advantages are. So I think this will be huge in the next few years. I mean, everything is changing weekly. It seems like what we're finding out and what we're discussing as a management team. I don't think we're there yet, at least in the dealership space, in terms of managing expenses and negotiating and renegotiating. But I think that'll change pretty quickly here in the landscape in the next few years. But this is a major focus of ours. We just had a company meeting, and we spent a good chunk of our time coming up with AI and how we can improve each department by keeping the same staff we have in place, but really changing our approach, seeing what we can automate. And I see dealerships doing the same thing across the board. Obviously in a different role than we're focused on. Um, but yeah, it's a changing space. We're seeing, I would say, technology used on the service side more. Booking
Mhm.
appointments. I found that out just booking an oil and tire rotation a few weeks ago. So I am seeing that used more and more in departments, but that's going to be a focus of ours as we're working with our clients here in the coming months, is how we can use AI together and really foster kind of longer standing relationships and but automating, right? Automating, looking to become more efficient. And yeah, it's a big space. I'm learning myself each week. I'm like, man, this is neat, not just professionally, but personally, what you can use
Sure.
AI for. I was doing it yesterday with um, some brown patches in my backyard. I'm like, what the heck is this? I took a few photos of it and it prescribed. It told me within seconds what was wrong in the yard. So it's a neat learning curve to uncover.
Well, and this will be my last question because you mentioned, you're using this in your personal life. I know that just, seeing from, having met you and sat at dinner and talked with you, many times and things like that, I know that faith and family are a big part of you personally. So how do you think that's played into you in your role at Strategic Source, your personal faith and your personal ethics and your wanting to be the best, leader you can for your family? How do you see how do you see those things tying together?
Yeah, my faith. I mean, I grew up in a Christian household, and Jesus was a big part of who we are and what we do. So that really translates to the business. You were talking about ethics and how we treat people and how you treat your clients and other suppliers we're working with. Reputation means everything, and especially being a small business that's been around for a while, but we've been able to grow based on how we've treated others. And I think that my faith component and what my parents have taught me and how that reflects on our business, how we treat employees, how we treat others, really is a driving force to how we make decisions. Uh, you know, giving back to the church consistently and just how we make decisions and live a prayerful life and really use God to guide us in this business, even the good times and the bad times. So it's been, especially being a family business, we're roughly 45 employees. We've got some independent contractors as well, but our business is built on faith. We realize we're blessed to be in this position. And, I've even had my daughters, I've got three girls, 15, 11, and 9 that have, come into the business too. So they're able to see how we work together as a family. Pretty much all my family's involved in the business and how we treat employees, but it all comes back to our faith and our faith in Jesus.
What a wonderful note to end on there. I can't agree with you more there. I think that a lot of people think that, you need to keep those sorts of conversations, those topics out of business, but I think it needs to be at the fundamental core of what you're doing, and those ethics are hugely important. So thank you for being willing to share that. I can't thank you enough. So as we wrap up here, Chris, if people want to know more about Strategic Source, and I can't imagine if they listen to this whole conversation, I can't imagine that they wouldn't want to know more about Strategic Source after hearing all the great things you guys are doing for dealers. What should they do? How can they reach out to you?
So contact us is probably best on our website. You go to strategicsource.com. If you're looking for more information, we've got plenty of tools out there, savings calculators. You can plug in your revenue, understand what your savings potential is, but really filling out the contact us form. If you provide your contact information, our team will reach out in less than a day, set up a demo, and really set up a discovery call to understand how you guys are making decisions, because every group is so different. So we do that discovery call, and we have plenty of questions to help qualify you, kind of fit you in the best model. But yeah, strategicsource.com that you see on the screen. My name is Chris Austin. I'll be heavily involved in the kind of the discovery phase as well. So feel free to reach out. It's a good time to do it too. We're starting to see a lot of vacations this time of year. Mark, you mentioned a lot of travel where the team is. June is super heavy. July, tends to scale back a bit with vacations and whatnot, and then August gets back into more business mode, I would say, with kids going back to school. But yeah, expecting a great summer as we plan for Q3 and Q4 coming up here. Hard to believe we're already here. So
It's crazy. Halfway through the year, and it feels like we just got started. It's part of
yep.
being old. Time moves faster than it did when I was a younger man. So, well, Chris, thank you so much for your time, ladies and gentlemen. This has been Chris Austin's Chief Revenue Officer at Strategic Source. This is Mark Baruth with Co-opable. This has been the Bark Report. If you liked what you heard today, please make sure that you subscribe to our channel. Share this conversation with as many people as you can, because everybody needs to hear about this. Give us a like, throw this on your LinkedIn so everybody can hear it. We're not too proud to ask for your support in sharing our podcasts. If you haven't listened to the previous episodes, please go back and check some of those out. They've been tremendous, and we have a lot of great guests coming up for you here in the near future as well. So, Chris, thanks so much for your time. Pleasure having you as a guest. You've been awesome. And everybody, we will see you on the next episode of the Bark Report. Take care.
Thank you, Mark. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Chris.